prefabrication was the right way to proceed. And that's sort of where I've ended up where I am with Eclipse, in that we panelize, prefabricate buildings. And I'm still quite convinced that that is the right way to approach high performance and prefabrication.
Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to another special episode of the Passive House podcast. It's a regular feed, but we are leading up to the reimagined prefab, which is fantastic. I'm Matthew Cutler Welsch, coming to you from Tamaki, Bukato, Auckland.
And I'm Zach Semke, coming to you from Seattle, Washington.
How are you, Zach?
I am great. It is beautiful and warm and sunny in Seattle, which is it's so gorgeous when it's like this. How about you?
It is beautiful and sunny in Auckland and freezing cold.
Yeah. The tables have turned.
Yeah, they're apparently not at my house, but more to the west in the hills. There was apparently some ice here yesterday morning, but there was certainly some ice in the South Island. Queenstown, Dunedin, Christchurch were in the 0 degrees and slightly negative. But Jonathan Holmes in his Passive House tells me that it was very, very comfortable, 21 degrees in his house at Hawea Flat, which is very nice. Contrary to a lot of other people who were very cold, and we were also told as a country that the lights may go out at 7 o'clock yesterday morning for 2 hours because apparently we hadn't been drilling for enough oil and gas and that we should open up our beautiful conservation land to allow more exploration of coal is apparently the solution to that, according to our government.
Never mind that the reason that there's this huge demand on the grid is because of all the heating energy in your leaky, crappy envelope buildings.
So there was a bunch of articles, and I was listening to the radio, and then I looked online, and I did a search for the words efficiency and insulation, and I didn't find any references to either words. My word search came up 0.
Oh,
for all
it's
of
so
those.
Frustrating.
So there was a lot of talk about windmills and hydro, and basically the debate is about where we should generate more energy from.
Right. Supply side, the demand
Total
side is
supply
always
side.
ignored. Yeah.
But I would like to I'll put a link in the show notes to a fantastic article that Jason Quinn wrote back in 2021 from some research done by Professor Michael Jack of the University of Otago. And Michael Jack's paper basically showed that if New Zealand was to invest in doing deep retrofits pretty much to Enerfit standard, we would reduce our winter peak demand of our grid by 80%.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the solution. That's our solution right there. Not to mention all the other health benefits and everything else that would, result from doing that.
Mm-hmm.
It's a total demand side issue. Granted, there are industries, and there was a conversation about EV charging, which we're not going to get into that because it's actually could be part of the solution as well, not part of the problem. But yeah. It was quite amazing that there wasn't one mention of the need to actually think about reducing our demand as opposed to, where are we going to get more energy from?
Yeah, that is a really common blind spot here in the United States, and not just by the sort of as you mentioned, there's all that talk about drilling for oil or gas and digging more coal. So not just from the fossil fuel industry, but ironically also from the clean energy sector. I think there's just a kind of knee-jerk kind of response to just say, hey, we're focusing on generation and new solar panels and wind turbines, which of course we need, no question whatsoever. But efficiency is so often ignored, especially building energy efficiency, and that in the U.S. too, we have these massive peaks in energy demand during the winter, and it's all because of our buildings.
Yeah.
And so what was cool, so I was recently, this past week, I was in Austin for the Passive House, or for the Humid Climate Conference that FIAS Alliance Austin does there every 2 years. And it was a great program. They did a really wonderful job on programming there. And Chris Nelder of the Energy Transitions Show, a podcast, one of my absolute favorite podcasts, was one of the speakers there. And so it's encouraging because he has this really big audience in the clean energy sphere. And he is beginning to really engage with building energy efficiency and passive house. So he had Ez Tressler from the CPhD from Scotland who did the DIY Enerfit. He had Ez on the show a few weeks ago, and then he was in Austin this past week, presenting about the impact on energy demand from buildings and the role that buildings can play in making this clean energy transition easier. And it basically makes everything easier. Fewer panels required, fewer turbines required, fewer batteries required, much more resilience, much more passive resilience to things like brownouts and blackhouses. So yeah. Anyway.
And that is more needed. Ironically, while we were experiencing this cold snap or record cold temperatures in May, I was putting some slides together for a presentation or a masterclass that we're doing on keeping cool, because we have an overheating issue. So right. In preparation for the coming summer in our hemisphere, we're doing a bit of work presenting, because there's nothing in our building code about preventing buildings getting too hot. And so I've been doing a little bit of research, and everything's pointing in that direction of not just warmer temperatures, but more humidity, because particularly in places like New Zealand, long skinny island, it's not just the air that's warming up, it's also the oceans are warming up, and all of that just leads to the air holding a lot more moisture. So we're getting warmer and more humid, and we're going to have to deal with that. And there's growing bodies of evidence. I've actually been pulling some research, and there's a lot available from the US that shows this correlation between increasing summer temperatures and increasing electricity demand, because more people have air conditioning now, and they want to be comfortable. So, excessive or increasing energy use is not just a winter problem, it's also becoming more and more of a summer problem.
Definitely.
Anyway, we're not going to solve all of the world's problems right here today. Fine. Tell us about the series. We've got the series that we're been doing now on prefab, and what's all this leading up to?
Yeah, that's right. So this is all leading up to our major event called Reimagine Buildings Prefab, which will be on May 17th. It starts at 11:30 a.m. Eastern on Friday, May 17th, our time. And it's this incredible coming together of some of the prefab pioneers in North America, talking about how they're harnessing prefab to make better buildings and the ways in which that's making it easier to deliver, the precision required by passive house buildings, also to incorporate low embodied carbon materials into the projects, what has been working in that effort. Also some, importantly, what pitfalls to avoid with prefab as well. So it's we're super excited about this event. Hope that folks will join us. It's going to be similar in production value and also in like networking opportunities and, fun interactive stuff to Reimagine Buildings 24. But it will be 3 hours of programming plus a round table with some manufacturers. So 4 hours, not 24 hours. So also I want to give a shout out to 3 sponsors of that event: Quantum Passive House, Reframe Systems, and Collective Carpentry. But we have, I think, 19 speakers who will be sharing their lessons learned and mistakes to avoid during that event. So if you're curious about how prefab might be applicable to your work, we hope you'll join us.
And I'm very pleased that prefab is such a global solution as well, which I'm discovering more and more in this part of the world, including Australia, which has got some great examples, which Darryn, our guest this week, is going to talk about. But before we get into that, we should also do a shout out to our other supporters of everything at the Passive House Accelerator.
Exactly. So a big thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Thanks also to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Glavel, Ingui Architecture, Minotaur, Partel, Rockwell North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. And thanks to our champion sponsors, Bewizo, Gradient, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, PH Air Seal, and Source 2050.
Great. All right. Well, this week I caught up with Darryn Parkinson from Sydney, Australia. Darryn's been building for over 25 years and really inspiring journey as I find a lot of people who kind of find Passive House pretty early on in Australia and New Zealand, and then go and in his case travel and find out more about it, and then see if there's a bit of a market for it. He's found that there is, which is fantastic, but has also looked at different ways of producing Passive House, and that has led him to setting up a factory, basically, turning a big shed, bringing over a butterfly table, and starting work with a prefabricated system that he's developed in Australia. So I started out by asking Darryn how he got into building in the first place. Tell us about how you got into building in the first place.
Building Passive House or building full stop?
Oh, building full stop. What made you want to pick up a hammer?
I'm very logic driven and very practical, and I've always wanted to know how things work and what makes things function, and pulled things apart, put them back together again. So I think there was a natural curiosity to continue that into a profession that was putting things together. And thankfully, building doesn't necessarily involve the pulling apart, but it tends to involve the putting it together. And so I ended up here simply because of that practical curiosity and bent that I had, and I pursued an apprenticeship and a carpentry early skill, and grew from that.
And what got you interested in sustainability?
I've been interested in sustainability to do with certainly with buildings, and since I started sort of in essence running my own company and building our own projects, when I looked at, certainly in Australia, the way we build houses hasn't actually really changed since the 70s. Like the fundamentals of what they are and the way the materials that are used and the performance of the houses, it isn't really progressing forward in trying to reduce the impact of a dwelling on the environment, both from the comfort and the health of the occupants and the impact it has on the environment. Like certainly, one of the big things that first was a big focus for me was one of the many droughts that Australia goes through, and the fact that we consume an enormous amount of water in a house, and somewhere like Sydney, where we live, has a limited water supply. We have 2 dams and catchments, and the whole city functions off water being kept in those dams. And in the 2005 to 2007, we're in a drought period in Australia, and the concept that showers just used water excessively and people carried on their lives excessively, and we did nothing to consume water that or reuse water, shall I say, in a house, because a huge amount of water that we waste in a building isn't water that should be sent to sewerage for treatment. Like some of it is like, and so there was an element of just that of not appearing very logical to me, that we would be in theory wasting like shower water. Like, yes, a human's been in there, but let's be honest, this is not dirty water that this shower has dealt with. And so the idea that there's grey water recycling, which technically grey water is shower water and from your sinks and your basins, and the fact that to clean that up, for that to be used in typically gardening or some sort of external activity is not that hard. This is pretty simple activity, exercise to clean this up. Yeah. And so there was just this moment of looking at construction and thinking how wasteful this is. Is there another way that this could and should be done?
So that's interesting. So the spark there is more around water efficiency as opposed to energy efficiency.
Yes, it was. I will say that my first spark was in water efficiency, and I think, like, if anyone in Australia says that isn't a spark for lots of things to happen, then they're not really paying attention adequately, because water is scarce everywhere in Australia, and it needs to be used with high efficiency. Whereas certainly up until recent years, we're a great coal digging nation, and we generate lots of electricity from coal. And when you dig your own coal and you burn it, electricity is quite economical. And so the concept of trying to be more energy efficient, it didn't translate into savings for people. And 20 years ago, people weren't really as focused on reducing fossil fuel usage as we are now. To me, I looked at coal and thought, why on earth are we doing that? But I didn't have an answer. And there's a reason why Australia has such a high photovoltaic uptake, because our climate is really good, so it's really easy and simple in vast parts of Australia to generate your own electricity, because we have lots of sun and it's constant.
Yeah. I didn't mention at the intro, but speaking of your climate, what is it and where exactly are you based?
So I'm based in Sydney, and Sydney is a very calm, benign climate. It's classified as a warm climate, and so it's never snowing and it's never crazy hot. Although I think there's some noticeable change in that, I think, and I think Sydney is about, over the coming 20 years, will become a much warmer location than it has been previously, and the humidity will increase, so it's going to start adopting a much warmer, more humid environment than it has previously or up until now. And that is, it is warm and quite humid in summer, but I think the last few summers, Sydney's dealt with some regular 35 to 40 degree runs of days, which it doesn't matter where you are, that's a warm temperature.
Well, especially if it's not dropping much below 30 degrees Celsius overnight, which I know can happen for periods of time.
Yes. Thankfully, that doesn't happen that often. The concern is ultimately, with a bit of global warming and climate change, who knows what we're going to be looking at in 10 to 20 years' time, in that, if it's 35 degrees during the day and it drops to 23 at night, let's hope that it doesn't get any worse than that.
Yeah.
Because...
Yeah. I know growing up in Adelaide, sometimes you get the heat waves there that do stick around for a couple of weeks, and it's bearable when they do drop below 20. You get the breeze in the afternoon. You can kind of cool things down. Where it becomes unbearable is where it's a bit more humid, it's a bit more cloud cover, and it keeps that heat in. And ironically, I think that is what we're going to see more of, is that humidity with the heat, and then it just makes it harder to deal with.
Yeah, definitely.
When did you first hear about Passive House?
I first heard about Passive House somewhere around 2016, 2017, I think, and I encountered this approach to building buildings that fundamentally was just logic driven, because the science behind it, it was logical, and it wasn't wishful. It wasn't there was no magic in this. There wasn't like three pieces of this and one piece of that and add them together. It was science based, and it resonated with me, and it also fundamentally highlighted what were clear deficiencies in the way we are typically building buildings, which is not being building envelope focused. Like that's a key component of Passive House, and that's what one of the key components that interests me the most, is that if you're going to build a building, whether it's a house or any building, and you need to focus on where the maximum efficiency of that building is, and that is in the envelope, so separating the conditions for the occupants from what's going on outside. Surely that's a key component of what a good building should be doing every day.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember where it was? Like who was it? Someone inspired you, or something you saw?
It came off the back of like a natural curiosity I have to try and find out. I like to think that I was doing things well, but I'm also not so arrogant enough to think that I know everything. Mm-hmm. And so the wonder of the internet is that I can be looking into the backyard of North America and Canada and Germany and seeing how they do things and thinking, yep, what are they doing that's different to us? And obviously there's quite a lot, but there's also not a lot. But certain things highlighted to me big differences, and things were around airtightness of buildings and quality of windows, and the nature of what these things are was very alien to me. Like Australia had no approach to airtightness in a building. So the fact that you even looked at this, I had to process this for quite a few months to understand what the hell is going on here. Like, what do you mean the airtightness? And I understood the reasons why, but there's a fundamental attitude in Australia that we have a benign climate, and therefore we have open and breezy buildings because our climate is so benign, and therefore there's this false truth that we build like this because it suits our climate, as opposed to, no, we just do this because we've been lazy and we've never really paid attention to it previously. And there's parts of Australia that have regular 35, 40 degree temperatures, which is horrible. And there's parts that are down around low single digits or minus numbers. So there's harsh climate and there's high humidity, and, anyone who thinks that having any of that inside your house is deluded. They're not paying attention to think that this is good to ever allow this to happen.
So it made sense to you. You like the science. Then how did you incorporate that into your business?
I had to teach myself what this was about, and so we had to try and understand how we could incorporate this into what we were doing in Australia. And so the idea that we would try and make buildings more airtight and try and improve the quality of the windows that we were fitting, it became an adventure exercise, because we didn't have access to any of the products that we can get now in Australia, whether they be airtight or vapor open membranes and the better quality windows. These just didn't exist in Australia, and so we had to try and understand what have we got that we can use. And to be fair, at about the time I was looking at it, a particular company turned up in Australia who make membranes, and I was hunting this down. what is this? Who are you? What have you
Right.
got? Show me it.
Yeah. So that was quite timely.
It was very serendipitous, I think. I think I was interested in building in a more efficient way, and these products turned up, and it was a starting point of saying, this is how you do it. Oh, okay, I know what this is because I've seen this on YouTube in North America. Right, now I understand. Oh, right, and this is how it works. Right, I understand now.
Yeah.
And so there was that sort of awakening.
So that was your sort of first leap. Then how did you get into prefab?
So we continued with what's called stick building a few buildings and using these better airtight membranes and better WRB membranes on the outside of buildings, and built several houses in this way. And it became quite obvious that this is the right way to do it. But I couldn't see how a business would survive if this was the way that you were going to continue to build this quality of building, because the amount of labour, time and effort would simply mean that no one would be able to afford to do this, because you couldn't fund it wasn't a business plan. Like if you were to write a business plan and this was approach to it, you wouldn't get past the third page, because fundamentally with the amount of time that you would spend trying to make airtight buildings at a site level would simply make them unaffordable. And you just wouldn't have a market, and it wouldn't be a strong enough business case. And again, I hunted down how do North Americans do this, and how do the Europeans? Passive house, well, it's German. What do they do about this?
Right.
They've already dealt with this, and they prefabricate. Lots of these people, they prefabricate their buildings, and I had to spend quite a bit of time comprehending what that means, because we don't have a particularly strong history in Australia of prefabricating dwellings, certainly not a high performance building, none. And pursuing it further, it became quite clear that a panelized approach to prefabrication was the right way to proceed. And that's sort of where I've ended up where I am with Eclipse, in that we panelize prefabricate buildings, and that I think is, I'm still quite convinced that is the right way to approach high performance and prefabrication.
Yeah. You mentioned that you didn't think it was viable to just try and do stick framing and make that high performance. But it is quite benign. So imagine the number of days that your teams can work on site is probably quite high when you compare that to Canada or harsher Scandinavian climates. What specifically is it, do you think, that makes it more of a viable option? Because there's not as many constraints weather-wise. What do you see as the key benefits?
The key benefit is the certainty of outcome. So because we we've designed as a system approach to the panelized building. So in theory, you're designing out the ability for there to be inconsistency or questions of how you deal with something, because it's designed into the system. You have far greater control of the costs. So stick building and making a building airtight after you've actually framed it in a slightly old school way means that you don't have the same control over the costs, because there's a lot of inconsistency that you have to deal with constantly, because you're encountering each building is potentially different. So although it might be made of timber frame, they look different. They have different junctions and different detailing. And so there's a whole lot of new adventure to be had. And so the ability to control where that cost sits is not really the same. Whereas if you build a building in a panelized format, like the way we do it is you build what's called a digital twin. You build a 3D model of the building in a panelized format. So you've actually dealt with all of the junctions and all of the detailing and how the building goes together in software. And so by the time the building comes together on site, putting it together is the easy part. The hard part of building, this is my view, and this has been proven every time I've done it, the hardest part is the time that we need to spend at the front end of the building in the factory, where we're creating a 3D model of the building.
Yeah. Just thinking about your business, because you're a builder, but it sounds like you're doing a lot more design work now.
We're certainly, I won't say moving away from building, but we see ourselves as a manufacturer of a panelized system. Mm-hmm. And that's what interests us the most, is continuing to deliver as many high-performance passive house level buildings as possible.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that's steering us towards the designing is the fact that when you're manufacturing anything, there's an efficient way to manufacture and an inefficient way to manufacture. And given that we understand where the efficiencies are because it's our system and our process, then having buildings designed around the most efficient way to deliver them ultimately leads to the best result for a client, because it's the most cost-effective way to achieve the best performance out of a building.
Yeah. How have you gone about upskilling to do that, to have the capability of digital modeling and creating digital twin, going through the design process of do you take an architect's drawings and then turn it into a panelized design, or do you?
Yes,
how do you work?
So the typical process is that you would take documentation from an architect, and we would turn that through our software into a panelized structure. So we would break the building down into panels, and we would build it in our software to replicate what's been created architecturally from the architect.
And is that you personally, or have you brought on other people, other expertise to do that?
No, I've got people we've trained, and like Australia, this is a really new industry.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
We've had to spend quite a bit of time dealing with this. Thankfully, there's the physical, like the actual software and equipment you need to do this. They exist in Australia and are being used elsewhere, and so we have really good support and really good knowledge, and there's quite a number of people, not a huge number, but enough people who understand what this is with enough skill that they can produce what we need to do. Probably the biggest issue is that the industry isn't there yet. So the concept that to maximise the efficiency of prefab and off-site manufacture, it has to start when the architect or the designer starts what they're doing.
Yeah.
Because at the moment, the system is that everybody involved draws their own new set of documents. So an architect will create a set of documents. We will take that and say, thank you very much. We'll go and repeat that in our own set of documents. And then hypothetically, the engineer will say, thank you, everybody. We're going to go and repeat that as well.
Yeah.
So all three of us are creating exactly the same building, but in our own way.
Right.
And that's just simply inefficient. That's an inefficient use of people, and ultimately it's cost, because somebody's paying for all of us to do the same building three times.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you work quite closely with a couple of regular architects and designers now?
We certainly have one architect we work quite closely with, and a couple of others who we're working on some projects with as well. I think one of the main things we're wanting to do is to get to the point where architects and designers are designing in the first place to do with the fact that it's going to be off-site manufactured, and when they're doing their work, a lot of what they can be done in software like Revit software, which is 3D software, can be a plug-in into our software. And so what happens is an architect can have done 70% of the job, so that the amount of work we need to do reduces. And that's not simply to make us lazy. That simply means that a client isn't paying us to do as much work. So the cost of the building comes down, because rather than us spend 4 weeks, if we spend 3 days doing what we need to with a great Revit model from an architect, isn't that to the better of the construction of buildings, full stop?
Yeah. Tell us about the factory, which you now have. So you've got a big shed.
Yep.
What was the biggest challenge for setting that up?
The biggest challenge was actually knowing what to do. I don't come from an off-site manufacturing background, so I came from zero, and so I had to look at how other people do this around the world, because Australia doesn't have a history of panelized construction. We have a long history of open frame, truss and frame manufacture. Like, that's a huge part of our construction industry, but that is very different to closed panel passive house approach to building, because the nature of what you're producing is quite different, and the way it's going to be joined is quite different. And so I had to learn and gain knowledge from elsewhere around the world, where they've been building panelized buildings for a decade. So if companies in North America and Europe have been doing this for 10 years, they know what they're doing. I need to learn from these people. I need to see what these people are doing. And what a lot of it was, the other side of it is that off-site manufacturing and prefabrication of buildings is really process and logic driven. It's a system and a process, and my brain works that way. I like a process driven and a system approach. And so the concept of how to create a manufacturing factory is process driven, because you start with raw materials and you end up with a finished product. Then there's a line between that. So what happens in that line? And there's phases and stages in that line. So the logic is, as long as you understand what it is you're doing every day, you can create the logic in the line, because you can see how you go from raw sticks of timber to a wall panel. And you know what the steps in between are.
And your process now, your system, you're doing closed panels, closed frames, putting windows in the factory? Yeah,
correct.
So transporting that all to site, and then you've got one example which we've had a look at, the Tala River project, which is a fantastic project. How long did it take on site to establish that, or to get the walls and the roof up?
That project was a 1 week of crane time. So it was in a week the building was up, and we generally have about another week of taping joints and finishing off once the structure's up and erected. And so typically in 2 weeks it's finished.
And what sort of scale are you hoping for? Where can you take this?
Well, it is quite limitless, because as I said, as a nation, we have, well, certainly in New South Wales, the state that I live in, we don't have a history of any off-site manufacture in a panelized format. Like, Australia has a pretty good history of modular buildings, so we've got a good history of modular build, but the issue is that we also have really varied topography in Australia, in that it's not really easy to get large trucks with big boxes of modules on the back to lots of places. Like a city like Sydney is split up by rivers everywhere, lots of bridges. It's quite a hilly city, and there's lots of places where you just simply won't get vehicles in carrying 12-metre long big boxes on the back in order to build buildings. And so a panelized system can go absolutely anywhere, and architecturally can create any architecture, because it isn't limited by the box approach to modular.
Right. So the crane that you need for panels is much smaller than a crane that's lifting a whole wing of a house or a whole house.
Look, potentially that's the case, although often what happens is the larger crane is often necessary simply because the access may not be good enough and the reach of a larger crane is required, and so it might be able to lift 20 tonne, but it's only carrying 1 tonne simply because it has to go 25 metres because Sydney can be quite tight, lots of trees. It's a really heavily tree-filled city, and overhead power in the streets is not underground power. So there's lots of issues to manage to work in somewhere like Sydney. Like obviously when we leave Sydney and we go to the country, access tends to be much better simply because land is better. But the fundamentals of a panelized system, it just provides greater flexibility around what can be produced and typically is, I think, as cost effective, if not more cost effective than a modular build anyway.
Yeah. Certainly, when we're comparing apples for apples, which is the trick, we're not comparing against standard builders.
That's correct.
And finally, do clients get it? Yeah. What's the feedback been from the market?
Do clients get passive house or prefab?
Well, both, I guess. I mean, are you really selling prefab to clients, or are you just selling the end product? Is how it's made an important factor for them or not?
Yes, I think it is. I think people certainly at the moment there's an understanding that off-site manufacture potentially has greater quality and certainty of outcome.
Yeah, right.
And that it's interesting because, again, probably like a lot of the world, there's a history of prefabrication after Second World War where it was simply about throwing up really cheap, quick accommodation for people, and they weren't quality buildings.
Yeah.
They were put up really quickly to try and provide living for people. And
yep.
I think the idea at the moment that prefabrication gives a high quality building, it provides lots of certainty, has lots of control. I think, Australia has a construction skills shortage at the moment. I think that's similar, a huge number of places around the world. And so I think the fact that you can eliminate a lot of that site-related skills shortage by comparison with stick-built buildings, because it's manufactured in the factory and comes together and in a week you're done, as opposed to months of stick building with people and trying to get people to maintain attention to it. So I think, there's definitely a lot of interest. A number of our projects are for people who self-build or own a build, and so by using a building envelope system like ours, what you've done is you've wiped out a huge portion of what you would normally be hunting some sort of contractor to be involved with. You've simply outsourced it to one company who's put the whole thing up.
Right.
And so then from an owner build or a self build, the completion of your house from that point is nowhere near as complicated because you're simply fitting it out inside, and many people have carried out internal refits in their house. Where they've done a whole lot of this work, so lots of people know how to do this already.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds like a really expandable model as well, because a lot of what gets sold is that stuff, the finishing stuff and how it looks on the inside. Whereas you can deliver a really quality envelope that can essentially be a white label to, whatever people want to put on the outside and the inside.
Look, that is the case. I think that there needs to be a little bit more knowledge and understanding by the general public around the importance of your building envelope to do with your performance. Like one of the disadvantages to the advantages of the climate in Australia and our uptake in photovoltaics is that there's this underhanded view that if you use air conditioning to cool your house, you just have a really big photovoltaic system on your roof that generates the energy. So it doesn't actually matter how much energy you use, because if it's free, what does it matter, because it's coming from the sun? But it's the logic that how big does your system actually need to be to generate the cooling you need for your really poor performing house? Wouldn't you be better to have a better performing house and a really tiny photovoltaic system that generates more than enough energy to run your smaller heating and cooling system?
Which comes comes back to the philosophy of waste right at the start about designing out waste, not just construction but also operationally.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Hey, look, awesome work. I'm really fascinated and inspired by people like yourself who are really kind of leading the way, setting up a new business, taking that leap of faith. You mentioned the word adventure, and I think it is that, because the outcome's a bit unknown. But where to from here? Where would you like to see things go in the next couple of years?
We want to be in a position that we are providing a large number of high performance houses for people, passive house houses for people constantly, and I think that will happen with people gaining a greater understanding of the health and comfort benefits of passive house. I don't think enough people understand the benefits that a good building envelope with a good ventilation system provides in the way of health for occupants.
Sure.
And I think that is the next, if you like, learning zone. I think the energy consumption of passive house is well known. I think that's been around for a while, but I think health and comfort for occupants is, I think, where the focus needs to move going forward to expand the market.
Nice. Where can people see your work?
Physically where?
Or online, if they're not as lucky to be in Sydney.
Yeah. On our website, eclipsepassivehouse.com.au, or our Eclipse Instagram has a number of photos, or
Awesome.
Our Eclipse YouTube.
Great. Yes, there's some great time-lapse videos you've got of putting some of your panels together on building sites, which are fun to watch as well. Thank you very much, Darryn, for your time.
Matt.
Really appreciate it, and thanks for your work as well. Like I said, I think it's very inspiring and really changing the state of the industries in this part of the world. It's great. And that was Darryn Parkinson, who is the founder and director of Eclipse Passive House, based just out of Sydney, central Sydney in Australia. What do you think, Zach?
Well, I mean, you alluded to this at the top of the show, that it's great to see that there's this global thing going on. When Darryn was talking about things like being concerned about the cost of on-site construction, the complexity of on-site construction around passive buildings, around, he was going into the power of the digital twin in the process, and the reasons that panelized systems make sense. All of that is really resonant here with the prefab pioneers in passive house in North America who are finding that this solves a lot of problems for them, so it was cool to see that's this is something that's happening all around the world, and also the fact that we can learn from one another, and that Darryn was looking at examples from folks who've been doing it for 10 years, to learn from it, and the recognizing that he didn't come from an offsite background, that he's starting at zero, but the nice thing about this is that we can borrow the learnings from others to jumpstart the process. So it's great.
Yeah, big fan of that, of learning what's worked. In fact, what's happened a few times in this part of the world is people actually buying things like butterfly tables from, they might be secondhand or refurbished from the Northern Hemisphere, and literally implanting that methodology into the setup here. And there's just no point in trying to reinvent something. Darryn was saying to me that they're working on these walls and they build them up and then realize they're quite heavy and they need a way to sort of pick them up and turn them over, and was thinking one day, wouldn't it be great if there was, I'm going to need to get a crane or something. And then he realized that this problem had already been solved, and hence, bringing a butterfly table over from Europe and setting it up in Sydney. Darryn used the term adventure a couple of times, and I thought that was really interesting because building a house is often adventure, and in some ways it shouldn't be. Because an adventure, the definition of adventure means an unknown outcome, and that's not something that we should be hoping for. It's an adventure for a client often in a good way, like it's an exciting thing, and there's this goal that you want to achieve, and it's a bit of a ride, but there should be an adventure. The adventure should be in starting out the business and the process, but the delivery of the product should be pretty well defined and known at the outset. And that is, I guess, the promise of prefabrication and developing that digital twin to a very high level of detail so that you know how many fasteners you need and how many meters of timber and all the other quantities of material and when you're going to need them. So you're kind of taking that adventure out of the individual building process so that the outcome is very well known. But I don't want to detract from the excitement of building a house, because it's a life-changing experience for a lot of people and can be a really positive experience to go through. It is a journey, but we should have that journey with a much more known outcome and and a bit less of an adventure.
You're right. Yeah. And that is the promise of Passive House. It's interesting, or prefab rather. It's interesting, when I think about adventure and prefab, I also think about what has been a scary adventure for some prefab companies. And that's that, things like ones like Katerra, these famous big, huge operations that with massive VC funding that have crashed and burned. And just like under the weight of the I guess the capital expense. I'm sure there are tons of, probably a couple books could be written about what happened to Katerra. I certainly don't have a special view into that, but this is a very capital intensive endeavor potentially. And I think that what is cool about stories like Darryn's, and also some of them that I'm learning more and more about here in the US and Canada, is this more kind of small scale more methodical step-by-step way of building a prefab business, so that it's not going with the massive modular solution at the outset, but instead learning how to do a panelized system and putting that together, the way that's more nimble, even in delivery in urban situations, as he was talking about with, not having to do a box. And that we want to also take the scary adventure out of the scenario for these businesses so that they can be successful. And so I feel like there's this new chapter happening right now in this industry that's more about that story than the big flashy $billion company story.
Yeah, and that's something that Ilka, I know, has thought a lot about, and they've discussed in some of their previous interviews, is that step up, because I think in some ways it feels like the step to going from just stick frame carpentry on site to doing what Darryn does, probably the collective carpentry, Burkhard in Melbourne, which is essentially doing higher performance framing, but just in a shed. It's still handmade walls. You're not having robots and big production lines in a massive factory. I feel like the step from on-site construction to that level of off-site construction is a smaller leap than it is to go to the full-on robotic automated factory, because that is a huge investment, and it requires a whole system, a whole industry-wide approach. So to get to the sort of Swedish levels of mass building manufacture, which is fully vertically integrated, and right from the forest through to the land development, that is quite a big step change, and it's kind of interesting exploring. I think there is more opportunity for that sort of scale in North America at the moment, just because of size of population and density. So it'll be interesting to see where things go. But my conversations with people like Darryn, their goals and aspirations are more along the lines of 10 to 20 houses per year. It's not sort of industry changing stuff from themselves. It is
right.
It's changing in terms of the paradigm, but they're not going to do it just from their little factory.
Just themselves, yeah, right. And then Chris Hill, who will be on the program for Reimagine Buildings Prefab, has developed a process and way and kind of model for creating these smaller facilities, and this vision for a network of smaller outfits who are therefore able to be more nimble. They don't have massive capital costs that they're debt that they're financing. And that's called the BOSS system. So I think that idea, that spirit of these smaller kind of operations is one that is alive and well.
Yeah.
And I think that what is the other piece of this is it's really, I think, a good fit and really relevant to us in this community now, because we're also still at that level. We're not, we don't have production builders doing thousands and thousands and thousands of houses, passive houses right yet.
Yeah.
I think that will happen, but we're not at that place yet. And so, you have people like Tessa Bradley of Artisans Group in Olympia, Washington, who is finding, it's actually collective carpentry, is finding that by working with a panelized prefab manufacturer that she can trust, and she knows that sort of passive house is baked into these panels, kind of, that she's able to scale up her work and do more projects and do bigger projects and do projects in new regions, because she can now work with all sorts of different general contractors. She doesn't have to work with her general contractors who are already trained up on passive house.
Right.
And so that kind of allows her to take that next step. And it's not like, it's not like this massive scale she's talking about, but it's really important scale, because once we, when more and more of folks in our community are able to make that leap, then we are talking about a step jump, like a 10x increase potentially.
Yeah.
With this more, I think, sustainable small scale approach.
Yeah. And I think here too, because as Darryn alluded to, and the people I've talked about here, we're very used to prefabrication. Every house that's built here has external walls that come from a factory. It's just that they're open frames and they're pretty flimsy and small. If that just happened to be a closed frame that arrives on site, and it's got insulation, it's probably twice as thick as what it is. It also has a weather tightness barrier on one side and an air tightness barrier pre-installed on one side, and maybe even comes with high performance windows. The only real difference is that you might need a slightly bigger crane to pick it from the truck and erect it. But the rest of the process can pretty much carry on as per standard building. It's definitely it can slot into a lot of existing practices.
Yeah. And actually, I've been learning about also there's some panelized systems that don't even require a crane. For like a 2-story building, they can just they can be on a pallet and go up on a forklift too.
Nice.
So there's a lot of there's this fun continuum, in that I think the more that's kind of a smooth continuum that doesn't require big huge jumps for us, I think the easier it is for us to actually take advantage of it.
Well, I think we've probably covered a lot of the content for the upcoming.
Hardly.
Oh, we're scratching the surface.
Only scratching the surface. Well, I mean, because we actually get the details about like how people are making this happen, for reals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you got 4 hours of prefab?
That's right. 4 hours of
dive?
prefab. Mm-hmm. That's indeed. It's going to be fun.
We mentioned at the top, people need to go and sign up if they're not already for Reimagine Prefab.
Yes.
Jump online and find out all about that. Do you want to say anything more about it?
Yeah, it's easy to find on our homepage. So go to passivehouseaccelerator.com, and at the top of the homepage, you'll see a snazzy little display about the event, and you can link to get more information about the speakers and the schedule and register there. And it's also approved for credits through American Institute of Architects, FIAS, and PHI as well.
Awesome. Well, that's probably the main thing. Anything else we need to plug?
So our Passive House Accelerator Live this week is with my very good friend, Dan Whitmore. So this is going to be a project showcase edition of the show. Dan will be presenting a new model for affordable passive house. So he has created this cool 11-unit development in Seattle called Red Willow Apartments, and all with private financing, but it's affordable to working people in Seattle, which is no small feat. So check that out this week, May 15th.
Awesome. And also in this part of the world, we have the Thrive Passive House Australia event is coming up on the 23rd of May, I think. And the Passive House, the New Zealand Passive House Conference is now open for registration. That will be coming up on the 12th to 13th of September. Is open to call for papers at the moment. So if you're interested in coming to New Zealand, Zach, you should submit a abstract for Passive House Conference, which will be held in Wellington on the 12th and 13th of September 2024.
Nice. So fun.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think that'll do us. I hope this week goes well. And don't forget, get your tickets and register for Reimagine Prefab. Should be a fantastic event.
Thanks,
and
Matthew.
We'll be back again next week on Passive House Podcast.